The first snow of the season arrived quietly in the high valley, dusting the rooftops and the pine branches like powdered sugar. Most people in the settlement welcomed it with smiles and laughter, believing it was nothing more than the usual early winter greeting. Children ran through the thin layer of white, kicking snow into the air, while their parents talked cheerfully about the coming holidays. But Eliza Morgan stood at the edge of the valley road with a bundle of firewood in her arms, watching the sky with a furrowed brow. She had lived in the mountains long enough to know that the sky sometimes whispered warnings before it shouted danger. The clouds were wrong. They moved low and heavy across the peaks, thick like wool blankets dragged slowly over the mountains. The wind carried a sharp bite that made the air feel thinner and colder than it should have been for early winter. Eliza shifted the wood in her arms and walked back toward her cabin. Her home stood alone at the edge of the forest, a small log structure built by her late husband many years ago. The settlement was a mile away down the valley, but Eliza preferred the quiet solitude of the trees. Inside the cabin, warmth from the fireplace greeted her as she pushed the door open with her shoulder. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. Above it hung a cast-iron kettle where stew simmered slowly, filling the room with the comforting smell of potatoes and herbs. Eliza stacked the firewood beside the hearth and brushed the snow from her coat. Most people in the valley thought she was overly cautious. They said she prepared for winter like it was an enemy army marching toward her door. But Eliza had learned her lessons the hard way. 3 winters ago, a storm had trapped half the settlement indoors for nearly 2 weeks. Food ran short, and many families had to rely on neighbors for help. Some of the ranchers had nearly lost their livestock. Since then, Eliza prepared early and quietly. She walked to the back of the cabin and opened a wooden trunk beneath the window. Inside were neatly folded bundles of wool blankets she had spent months spinning and weaving. One by one, she carried them to a small storage room beside the kitchen. The room had once been used for tools, but now it served another purpose. Stacked along the walls were bundles of wool, thick blankets, sacks of dried vegetables, and carefully cut firewood. Anyone visiting the cabin might think it strange that she kept firewood inside rather than outside in the shed. But Eliza preferred it that way. Dry wood burned hotter and longer, and she never trusted winter to behave politely. Later that afternoon, she hitched her mule to a small cart and rode into the settlement. The general store buzzed with chatter when she stepped inside. "Afternoon, Eliza," called Mr. Whittaker from behind the counter. "Afternoon." She placed several coins on the counter. "I'll take another sack of flour and 2 lantern oil bottles." Whittaker raised his eyebrows, stocking up already. Eliza nodded. "I believe the snow will come heavier this year." Several men sitting near the stove chuckled. "Snow comes every year." One of them said. "Yes," Eliza replied calmly, "but sometimes it comes angry." The man grinned. "Well, if winter gets angry, we'll just shout back." Laughter spread through the room. Eliza simply collected her supplies. She had long ago stopped trying to convince others to prepare. Some lessons only arrived when the storm did. By the time she returned home, the sky had darkened to a dull gray. The wind had grown stronger. Pine branches swayed heavily as if something invisible pushed through the forest. Eliza carried the flour and oil inside, then walked around the cabin checking each shutter and latch. She reinforced the door beam. She added another stack of wood beside the fireplace. Then she carried 3 more bundles of wool into the storage room. Night fell early. The wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the cabin walls. Eliza sat in her rocking chair beside the fire, knitting slowly while listening to the storm gathering strength outside. Snow began to fall again, but this time it did not drift gently. It whipped sideways through the air like sharp white needles. By midnight, the blizzard had arrived. The world outside disappeared beneath roaring wind and endless snow. The cabin trembled under the assault of the storm, but the thick logs held firm. Eliza rose from her chair and placed another piece of firewood on the flames. She had seen storms before, but something about this one felt different. The wind screamed through the valley like a living creature searching for weakness. Morning never truly arrived. Only a dim gray light seeped through the frosted windows. When Eliza opened the door slightly to check outside, a wall of snow pushed against it. The storm had buried the lower half of the cabin. She shut the door again and slid the wooden beam firmly into place. The blizzard continued, hour after hour, day after day. Snow piled against the walls until the windows became white squares of frozen light. The wind roared endlessly, shaking the forest and burying the valley beneath towering drifts. Inside the cabin, Eliza moved calmly from task to task. She fed the fire, she cooked simple meals, she wrapped herself in thick wool when the temperature dropped during the night. Because she had hidden firewood inside the cabin, the storm could not reach it. Because she had stored wool blankets inside the walls, the cold could not steal her warmth. On the third day, the wind grew even stronger. It howled through the trees like wolves. For a moment, Eliza wondered how the settlement was faring down the valley. Most families kept their wood piles outside. If the storm buried them, she pushed the thought away. Worry would not help anyone. Instead, she added another log to the fire and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. On the fifth morning, the wind finally began to weaken. The blizzard faded slowly, leaving behind an eerie silence. When Eliza opened the door again, the world had transformed into a frozen ocean of white. Snowdrifts reached nearly to the roof. The path to the settlement had vanished completely, but inside her cabin, the fire still burned warmly. Her wool blanket still kept the cold away. Her food supplies remained safe. Days later, when the men from the valley finally dug their way through the deep snow to check on her, they stared in amazement at the warm smoke rising from her chimney. Many cabins in the settlement had run out of firewood. Several families had huddled together for warmth. Some had nearly frozen during the worst nights of the storm, but Eliza Morgan welcomed the rescuers with hot soup and steady warmth. One of the men looked around the cabin and shook his head. "You prepared for this like you knew it was coming." Eliza smiled softly and handed him a steaming bowl. "I didn't know," she said. "I only listened." "Listened to what?" She glanced toward the mountains where the last clouds drifted away from the peaks. "The wind," she replied. And as the valley slowly began to recover from the worst blizzard anyone could remember, people spoke often about the quiet woman at the forest's edge. The woman who had hidden wool and fire would inside her cabin, not knowing it would save her life when the ice-cold blizzard finally came.